Ugly Bird by Manly Wade Wellman. Who fears the devil? Says Jane unto Jim. Who fears the devil? Says Jim unto Joan. Who fears the devil? Says Joan unto John. Not I, not I, says John all alone. From a game song once popular with Southern children. John's my name. Where I've been is places. And what I've seen is things. And there's been times I've run off from seeing them, off to other places and things. I keep moving, me and this guitar with the silver strings to it, slung behind my shoulder. Sometimes I've got food with me, and an extra shirt maybe, but most times just the guitar, and trust to God for what else I need. I don't claim much. John's my name, and about that I'll only say I hope I've got some of the goodness of good men who've been named it. I'm no more than just a natural man. Well, maybe taller than some. Sure enough, I fought in the war across the sea, but so does near about every man in war times. Now I go here, go there, and up and down from place to place, and from thing to thing, here in among the mountains. Up these heights and down these hollows, you'd best go expecting anything. Maybe everything. What's a long time ago let off happening outside still goes on here. And the tales the mountain folks tell sound truer here than outside. About what I tell you, if you believe it, you might could get some good thing out of it. If you don't believe it, well, I don't have a gun out to make you stop and hark at it. I swear I'm licked before I start trying to tell y'all what Mr. Anselm looked like. Words give out sometimes. The way you're purely frozen to death for fit words to tell the favor of the girl you love. And Mr. Anselm and I pure poison hated each other from the start. That's a way that love and hate are alike. He's what folks in the country call a low man, meaning he's short and small, but a low man is low other ways than in inches sometimes. Mr. Anselm's shoulders didn't wide out as far as his big ears, and they sank and sagged. His thin legs bowed in at the knee and out at the shank like two sickles put point to point. His neck was as thin as a carrot, and upon his head, and on it his head looked like a swollen up pale gourd. Thin hair, gray as tree moss, loose mouth a little bit open to show long straight teeth. Not much of a chin. The right eye squinted, mean and dark, while the hack of his brow stretched the left one wide open. His good clothes fitted his mean body as if they were cut to its measure. Those good clothes of his were almost as much out of match to the rest of him as his long, soft, pink hands, the hands of a man who'd never had to work a tap's worth. You see now what I mean? I can't say just how he looked, only that he looked hateful. I first met him when I was coming down from that high mountains comb along an animal trail. Maybe a deer made it. I was making to go on the valley and through a pass onto Hark Mountain, where I'd I'd heard tell was the bottomless pool. No special reason, just I had a notion to go there. The valley had trees in it, and through and among the trees I saw here and there down the slope patchy places and cabins and yards. I hoped to myself I might could get fed at one of the cabins, for I'd run clear out of eating some spell back. I didn't have any money, nary coin of it, just only my hickory shirt and blue jeans pants and torn old army shoes and my guitar on its slang cord. But I knew the mountain folks. If they've got anything to eat, a decent-spoken stranger can get the half part of it. Town folks ain't always the same way about that. Down the slope I picked my way, favoring the guitar just in case I slipped and fell down. And in an hour I'd made it to the first patch. The cabin was 2 rooms, dog-trotted and open through the middle. Beyond it was a shed and a pig pen. In the yard was the man of the house, talking to who I found out later was Mr. Onslow. "You don't have any meat at all?" Mr. Onslow inquired him, and Mr. Onslow's voice was the last you'd expect his sort of man to have. It was full of broad, low music, like an organ in a big town church. But I decided not to ask him to sing when I'd taken another closer glimpse of him, sickle-legged and gourd-headed and pale and puny in his fine-fitting clothes. For, small as he was, he looked mad and dangerous. And the man of the place, though he was a big, strong-seeming old gentleman with a square jaw, looked scared. "I've been right short this year, Mr. Onslow," he said. And it was a half-begging way he said it. "The last bit of meat I done fished out of the brine on Tuesday, and I'd sure enough rather not kill the pig till December." Mr. Onslow tramped over to the pen and looked in. The pig was a friendly-acting one. It reared up with its front feet against the boards and grunted up the way you know he hoped for something nice to eat. Mr. Onslow spat into the pen. "All right," he said, granting a favor, "but I want some meal." He sickle-legged back toward the cabin. A brown barrel stood out in the dog-trot. Mr. Onslow flung off the cover and pinched up some meal between the tips of his pink fingers. "Give me a sack," he told the man. The man went quick indoors, and quick out he came with the sack. Mr. Onslow held it open while the man scooped out enough meal to fill it up. Then Mr. Onslow twisted the neck shut, and the man lashed the neck with twine. Finally, Mr. Onslow looked up and saw me staring there, with my guitar under my arm. "Who are you?" he asked, sort of crooning. "My name's John," I said. "John what?" Then he never waited for me to tell him John what. "Where'd you steal that guitar at?" "This was given to me," I replied him. "I strung it with the silver wires myself." "Silver," said Mr. Onslow, and he opened his squint eye by a trifle bit. "Yes, sir." With my left hand I clamped a cord. With my right thumb I picked the silver string to a whisper. I began to make up a song. "Mr. Onslow, they do what you tell him." "That'll do," said Mr. Onslow, not so singingly. And I stopped with the half-made-up song. He relaxed and let his eye go back to a squint again. "They do what I tell them," he said, halfway to himself. "Not bad." We studied each other, he and I, for a few ticks a time. Then he turned away and went tramping out of the yard and off among the trees. When he was gone from sight, the man of the house asked me, right friendly enough, what he could do for me. "I'm just walking through," I said. I didn't want to ask him right off for some dinner. "I heard you name yourself John," he said. "Just so happens my name's John too, John Bristow." "Nice place you got here, Mr. Bristow," I said, looking around. "You cropping or are you renting?" "I own the house and the land," he told me, and I was surprised, for Mr. Onslow had treated him the way a mean-minded boss treats a cropper. "Oh," I said, "and that Mr. Onslow was just a visitor." "Visitor?" Mr. Bristow snorted out that word. "He visits every living soul around here. lets him know what thing he wants, and they pass it to him. I kinda thought you knew him. You sang about him so ready. Oh, I just got that up. I touched the silver strings again. Many a new song comes to me, and I just sing it. That's my nature. I love the old songs better, said Mr. Bristow, and smiled. So I sang one. I had been in Georgia not many more weeks than 3 when I fell in love with a pretty fair girl, and she fell in love with me. Her lips were red as red could be, her eyes were brown as brown, her hair was like a thundercloud before the rain comes down. Gentlemen, you ought to have been there to see Mr. Bristow's face shine. He said, by God, John, you sure enough can sing it and play it. It's a pure pleasure to hark at you. I do my possible best, I said, but Mr. Onslow doesn't like it. I thought for a moment, then I inquired him. What's the way he can get everything he wants in this valley? Phew. Can't tell you what way, just done it for years he has. Doesn't anybody refuse him? Well, it's happened. Once they said old Jim Desborough refused him a chicken, and then Mr. Onslow pointed his finger at old Jim's mules. They was a-plowing at the time. Them mules couldn't move nary hoof, not till Mr. Onslow had the chicken from old Jim. Another time, Miss Tilly Palmer hid in a cake she'd just baked when she seen Mr. Onslow coming. He pointed a finger at her, and he dumbed her. She never spoke a mumbling word from that day on till the day she lay down and died. Could hear and know what was said to her, but when she tried to talk, she could only just gibble. Then he's a hoodoo man, I said. And that means the law can't do a thing to him. No, sir. Not even if the law was worried itself about anything going on this far from the county seat. He looked at the meal sack still standing in the dog trot. Near about time for the ugly bird to come fetch Mr. Onslow's meal. What's the ugly bird? I asked. But Mr. Bristow didn't have to tell me that. It must have been a hanging up there over us. High and quiet, and now it dropped down into the yard like a fish hawk onto a pond. First out I could see it was dark, heavy-winged, bigger by right much than a buzzard. Then I made out the shiny gray-black of the body, like wet slate, and how the body looked to be naked, how it seemed there were feathers only on the wide wings. Then I saw the long, thin, snaky neck and the bulgy head and the long crane beak. And I saw the 2 eyes set in front of the head, set man fashion in the front, not bird fashion, one on each side. The feet grabbed for the sack and taloned onto it, and they showed pink and smooth with 5 grabby toes on each one. Then the wings snapped, like a tablecloth in the high wind, and it went churning up again and way over the tops of the trees, taking the sack of meal with it. That's the ugly bird, said Mr. Bristow to me, so low I could just about hear him. Mr. Onslow's been companioning with it ever since I could recollect. Such a sort of bird I never saw before, I said. Must be a right scarce out one. Do you know what struck me while I was watching it? Most likely I do know, John. It's got feet that look like Mr. Onslow's hands. Could it maybe be, I asked, that a hoodoo man like Mr. Onslow knows what way to shape himself into a bird thing? But Mr. Onslow shook his gray head. It's known that when he's at one place, the ugly bird's been sighted at another. He tried to change the subject. Silver strings on your guitar. I never heard tell of aught but silver, but steel strings. In the olden days, I told him, silver was used many a time for strings. It gives a more singy sound. In my mind, I had it made sure that the subject wasn't going to be changed. I tried a chord on my guitar and I began to sing. Y'all have heard of the ugly bird, so curious and so queer. It flies its flight by day and night and fills folks' hearts with fear. John, Mr. Bristow began to butt in, but I sang on. I never came here to hide from fear, and I give you my promised word that I soon expect to twist the neck of that dang old ugly bird. Mr. Bristow looked sick at me. His hand trembled as it felt in his pocket. I wish I could bid you stop and eat with me, he said, but here, maybe you better buy you something. What he gave me was a quarter and a dime. I near about gave him back, but I saw he wanted me to have them. So I thanked him kindly and walked off down the same trail through the trees Mr. Onslow had gone. Mr. Bristow watched me go, looking shrunk up. Why had my song scared him? I kept singing it. Oh, ugly bird, you spy and sneak and thieve. This place can't be for you and me, and one of us gotta leave. Singing, I tried to recollect all I'd heard or read or guessed that might help toward studying out what the ugly bird was. Didn't witch folks have partner animals, I'd read and heard tell about the animals called familiars? Mostly, they were cats, or black dogs, or such matter as that. But sometimes, they were birds. That might could be the secret, or a right much of it, for the ugly bird wasn't Mr. Onslow, changed by witching so he could fly. Mr. Bristow had said the two of them were seen at different places at one and the same time. So Mr. Onslow could no way turn himself into the ugly bird. They were close partners. No more. Brothers. With the ugly bird's feet looking like Mr. Onslow's hands. I was aware of something up in the sky. The big black V of something that flew. It quartered over me, half as high as the highest scrap of woolly white cloud. Once or twice it made a turn, seemingly like wanting to stoop for me, like a hawk for a rabbit. But it didn't do any such. Looking up at it and letting my feet find the trail on their own way, I rounded a bunch of mountain laurel, and there, on a rotten log in the middle of the clearing, sat Mr. Onslow. His gored head was sunk on his thin neck. His elbows sat on his crooked knees, and the soft, pink, long hands hid his face, as if he felt miserable. The look of him made me feel disgusted. I came walking close to him. You don't feel so brash, do you? I asked him. Go away. He sort of gulped, soft and tired and sick. What for? I wanted to know. I like it here. Sitting on the log next to him, I pulled my guitar across me. I feel like singing, Mr. Onslow. I made it up again, word by word, as I sang it. His father got hung for hog stealing. His mother got burned for a witch. And his only friend is the ugly bird. That dirty something hit me like a shooting star, slamming down from overhead. It hit my back shoulder and it knocked me floundering forward on one hand and one knee. It was only the mercy of God I didn't fall on my guitar and smash it. I crawled forward a few quick scrambles and made to get up again, shaky and dizzy to see what had happened. I saw. The ugly bird had flown down and dropped the sack of meal on me. Now it skimmed across the clearing at the height of the low branches. Its eyes glinted at me and its mouth came open like a pair of scissors. I saw teeth, sharp and mean like the teeth of a garfish. Then the ugly bird swooped for me, and the wind of its wings was colder than a winter tempest storm. Without thinking or stopping to think, I flung up my both hands to box it off from me, and it gave back. It flew back from me like the biggest, devilishest hummingbird you ever seen in a nightmare. I was too dizzy and scared to wonder why it pulled off like that. I had barely the wit to be glad it did. "Get out of here," moaned Mr. Onslow, not stirring from where he sat. I take shame to say I got. I kept my hands up and backed across the clearing into the trail on the far side. Then I halfway thought I knew where my luck had come from. My hands had lifted up my guitar, up as the ugly bird flung itself at me. In some way, it hadn't liked the guitar. Reaching the trail again, I looked back. The ugly bird was perching on the log where I'd been sitting. It slouched along, close to Mr. Onslow, sort of nuzzling up to him. Horrible to see, I'll be sworn. They were sure enough close together. I turned and stumbled off away along the trail down the valley and off toward the pass beyond the valley. I found a stream with stones making steps across it. I followed it down to where it made a wide pool. Then I got on my knee and washed my face. It looked pale as clabber in the water image, and sat down with my back to a tree and hugged my guitar and had a rest. I was shaking all over. I must have felt near about as bad for a while as Mr. Onslow had looked to feel, sitting on that rotten log to wait for his ugly bird, and what else? Had he been hungry near to death? Sick? Or maybe had his own evil set back on him? I couldn't rightly say which. But after a while I felt some better. I got up and walked back to the trail and along it again, till I came to what must have been the only store thereabouts. It faced one way on a rough, gravelly road that could carry wagon traffic. Car traffic, too, if you didn't mind your car getting a good shake-up. And the trail joined on there, right across from the doorway. The building wasn't big, but it was good. Made of sawed planks, and there was paint on it, well painted on. Its bottom rested on big rocks instead of posts, and it had a roofed open front like a porch, with a bench in there where folks could sit. Opening the door, I went in. You'll find many such stores in backcountry places throughout the land, where folks haven't built up their towns too close. 2, 3 counters, shelves of cans and packages. Smoked meat hung up in one corner, a glass-fronted icebox for fresh meat in the other. Barrels here and there for beans or meal or potatoes. At one end of one counter, a sign says U.S. Post Office, and there's a set of maybe half a dozen pigeonholes to put letters in, and a couple of cigar boxes for stamps and money order blanks. That's the kind of place it was. The proprietor wasn't in just then. Only a girl, scared and shaky, back of the counter, and Mr. Onslow there ahead of me, telling her what it was he wanted. He wanted her. "I don't care a shuck if Sam Heaver did leave you in charge here," he said with the music in his voice. "He won't stop my taking you with me." Then he heard me come in, and he swung round and fixed his squint eye and his white eye on me, like 2 mismatched gun muzzles. "You again," he said. He looked right hale and hearty again. I strayed my hands over the guitar's silver strings, just enough to hear, and he twisted up his face as if it colicked him. "Winnie," he told the girl, "wait on this stranger and get him out here." Her round eyes were scared in her scared face. I thought inside myself that seldom I'd seen as sweet a face as hers, or as scared a one. Her hair was dark and thick. It was like a thundercloud before the rain comes down. It made her paleness look paler. She was small and slim, and she cowered there, for the fear of Mr. Onslow and what he'd been saying to her. "Yes, sir," she said to me, hushed and shaky. "A box of crackers, please, ma'am," I decided, pointing where they were on the shelf behind her. And a can of those little sardine fish." She put them on the counter for me. I dug out the quarter Mr. Bristow had given me up the trail and slapped it down on the countertop between the scared girl and Mr. Onslow. "Get away," he squeaked, as shrill and sharp and mean as a bat. When I looked at him, he jumped back almost halfway across the floor from the counter. And for just once, both his eyes were big and wide. "Why, Mr. Onslow, what's the matter?" I wondered. And I purely was wondering. "This is a good quarter." I picked it up and held it out for him to take and study, but he flung himself around and he ran out of that store like a rabbit. A rabbit with dogs running it down. The girl he'd called Winnie just leaned against the wall as if she was bone-tired. I asked her, "Why did he light out like that?" I gave her the quarter and she took it. "That money isn't a scary thing, is it?" I asked. "Doesn't much scare me," she said, rang it up on the old cash register. "All that scares me is Mr. Onslow." I picked up the box of crackers and sardines. "Is he courting you?" She shivered, although it was warm in the store. "I'd sooner be in a hole with a snake than be courted by Mr. Onslow." "Then why not just tell him to leave you be?" "He wouldn't hark at that," she said. "He always does just what pleasures him. Nobody dares to stop him." "So I've heard tell," I nodded. "About the mules he stopped where they stood, and the poor lady he struck dumb." I returned the other thing we'd been talking. "But what made him squinch away from that money piece? I reckon he loved money." She shook her head, and the thundercloud hair stirred. "Mr. Onslow never needs any money. He takes what he wants without paying for it." "Including you?" I asked. "Not including me yet." She shuddered again. "He reckons to do that later on." I put down my dime I had left from what Mr. Bristow had gifted me. "Let's have a Coke drink together, you and me." She rang up the dime, too. There was a sort of dried-out chuckle at the door, like a stone flung, rattling down a deep well. I looked quick, and I saw two long, dark wings flop away outside. The ugly bird had come to spy what we were doing. But the girl Winnie hadn't seen, and she smiled over her Coke drink. I asked her permission to open my fish and crackers on the bench outside. She said I could. Out there I worried open the can with that little key that comes with it and had my meal. When I'd finished, I put the empty can and cracker box into a garbage barrel and tuned my guitar. Hearing that, Winnie came out. She told me how to make my way to the pass and on beyond to Hark Mountain. Of the bottomless pool, she had heard some talk, though she'd never been to it. Then she harked while I picked music and sang the song about the girl whose hair was like the thundercloud before the rain comes down. Harking, Winnie blushed till she was pale no more. Then we talked about Mr. Onslow and the ugly bird, and how they'd been seen in 2 different places at once. "But," said Winnie, "nobody's ever seen the 2 of them together." "I have," I told her. "Not an hour back." And then I related about how Mr. Onslow had sat, all sick and miserable, on that rotten log, and how the ugly bird had lighted beside him and crowded up to him. She was quiet to hear about it all, with her eyes staring off the way she might be looking for something far away. When I was done, she said, John, you tell me it crowded right up to him. It did that thing, I said again. You'd think it was studying how to crawl right inside him. Inside him! That's the true fact. She kept staring off and thinking. Makes me recollect something I heard somebody say once about hoodoo folks, she'd said after a time. How there's hoodoo folks can sometimes put a sort of stuff out, mostly in a dark room. And the stuff is part of them, but it can take the shape and mind of some other person. And once in a while, the shape and mind of an animal. I said, now you mention it, I've heard some talk of the same thing, and somebody reckoned it might could explain those Louisiana stories about the werewolves. The shape and mind of an animal, she repeated or said. Maybe the shape and mind of a bird. And that stuff, they call it ectoplasm. I remember the word. That's it. I've even seen a book with pictures in it. They say we're taken of such stuff, and it seems to be alive. It'll yell if you grab it or hit it or stab at it or like that. Couldn't, maybe, Winnie began, but a musical voice interrupted. I say he's been here long enough, Mr. Onson was telling somebody. Back he came. Behind him were 3 men. Mr. Bristow was one, and there was likewise a tall, gawky man with wide shoulders and a black, stubbly chin, and behind him a soft, smooth, grizzled old man with an old fancy vest over his white shirt. And Mr. Onson was the leader of a posse. Sam Heaver, he crooned at the soft, grizzled one. Do you favor having tramps come and loaf around at your store? The old soft storekeeper looked at me dead and gloomy. Son, you better get going, he said as if he'd memorized it. I laid my guitar on the bench beside me, very careful of it. You men ail my stomach, I said, looking at them from one to the next to the next. You come at the whistle of this half-born, half-bred witch man. You let him sick you on me like dogs, and I'm hurting nobody and nothing. You better go, said the old storekeeper again. I stood up and faced Mr. Onson, ready to fight him. He just laughed at me like a sweetly played horn. You, he said, without a dime in your pocket. What are you a-feathering up about? You can't do anything to anybody. Without a dime. But I'd had a dime. I'd spent it for the coke drinks for Winnie and me. And the ugly bird had spied in me to see me spend it. My silver money. The silver money that had scared and ailed Mr. Onson. Take his guitar, Hobie, Mr. Onson said in order, and the gawky man moved, clumsy, but quickly, and grabbed my guitar off the bench and back away to the inner door. There, said Mr. Onson, sort of purring. That takes care of him. He fairly jumped, too, and grabbed Winnie by her wrist. He pulled her along, out of the porch, toward the trail, and I heard her whimper. Stop him, I yelled out, but the 3 of them stood and looked, scared to move or say a word. Mr. Onson, still holding Winnie with one hand, faced me. He lifted his other hand and struck out the pink forefinger at me, like the barrel of a pistol. Just the look his 2 eyes, squint and wide, made me weary and dizzy to my bones. He was going to witch me, as he'd done to the mules, as he'd done to the woman who'd tried to hide her cake from him. I turned away from his gaze, sick, and sure I was afraid. And I heard him giggle, thinking he'd won already. I took a stop, and I was next to that gawky fellow named Hobie, who held my guitar. I made a long, quick jump and started to wrestle it away from him. "Hang on that thing, Hobie," I heard Mr. Onsom sort of choke out, and from Mr. Bristow, "Take care, there's the ugly bird." Its big, dark wings flapped up like a storm in the air just behind me, but I'd shoved my elbow into Hobie's belly pit, and I'd torn my guitar from his hands, and I'd turned on my heel to face what was being brought upon me. A little way off in the open, Mr. Onsom stood stiff and straight as a stone figure in front of an old courthouse. He still held Winnie by the wrist. Right betwixt them came a-swooping the ugly bird at me, the ugliest ugly of all, its long, sharp beak pointing for me like a sticky knife. I dug my toes and smashed my guitar at it. I swung the way a player swings at a ball bat at a pitched ball. Full slam I struck its bulgy head, right above that sharp beak and across its two eyes, and I heard the loud noise as the polished wood of my music maker crashed to splinters. Oh, gentlemen. And down went that ugly bird. Down it went, falling just short of the porch. Quiet it lay, its great big feathered wings stretched out either side without e'er a flutter to him. Its beak was driven into the ground like a nail. It didn't kick or flop or stir once. But Mr. Onsom, where he stood, holding Winnie, screamed out the way he might scream if something had clawed out all his insides with one single tearing dig and grab. He didn't move. I don't even know if his mouth came rightly open to make that scream. Winnie gave a pull with all the strength she had and tottered back, loose from him. Then, as if his only hold on her had kept him standing, Mr. Onsom slapped right over and dropped down on his face, his arms flung out like the ugly bird's wings, his face in the dirt like the ugly bird's face. Still holding on to my broken guitar by the neck, like a club, I walked over to him and stopped. "Get up," I bade him, and took hold of what Harry had and lifted up his face to look at it. One look was aplenty. From the war, I knew a dead man when I see one. I let go of Mr. Onsom's hair, and his face went back into the dirt the way you'd know it belonged there. The other men moved at last, slow and tottery like old men. And they didn't act like my enemies now, for Mr. Onsom, who'd made them act that way, was down and dead. Then Hobie gave a sort of shaky, scared shout, and we looked where he was looking. The ugly bird looked all of a sudden rotten and mushy, and while we saw that, it was soaking into the ground. To me, anyhow, its body had seemed to turn shadowy and misty, and I could see through it, to pebbles on the ground beneath. I moved close, though I didn't relish moving. The ugly bird was melting away like dirty snow on top of a hot stove, only no wetness left behind. It was gone, while we watched and wondered and felt bad all over, and at the same time, glad to see it go. Nothing left but the hole punched in the dirt by its beak. I stepped closer yet, and with my shoe I stamped the hole shut. Then Mr. Bristow kneeled on his knee and turned Mr. Onsom over. On the dead face ran lines across, thin and purple, as though he'd been struck down by the blow from a toaster or a gridiron. "Why," said Mr. Bristow, "why, John, them's the marks of your silver strings." He looked up at me. "Your silver guitar strings." "Silver?" said the storekeeper. "Is them strings silver? My friends, Silver finishes a hoodoo, man. That was it. All of us remembered that at once. Sure enough, put in Hobie. Ain't it a silver bullet that it takes to kill a witch, or hanging, or burning, and a silver knife to kill a witch's cat? And a silver key locks out ghosts, doesn't it? Said Mr. Bristow, getting up to stand among us again. I looked at my broken guitar and the dangling strings of silver. What was the word you said? Winnie whispered to me. Ectoplasm, I replied her, like his soul coming out of him and getting itself struck dead outside his body. Then there was talk, more important, about what to do now. The men did the deciding. They allowed to report to the county seat that Mr. Anselm's heart had stopped on him, which was what it had done, after all. They went over the tale 3-4 times to make sure they'd all tell it the same. They cheered up while they talked. You couldn't ever call for a bunch of gladder folks to get shed of a neighbor. Then they tried to say their thanks to me. John, said Mr. Bristow, we're all of us sure enough be proud and happy if you'd stay here. You took his curse off of us, and we can't never thank you enough. Don't thank me, I said. I was fighting for my life. Hobie said he wanted me to come and live on his farm and help him work it on his half shares. Sam Heaver offered me all the money he had in the old cash register. I thanked him. To each I said, no, sir, thank you kindly. I better not. If they wanted their tale to sound true to the sheriff and the coroner, they'd better help it along by forgetting that I'd ever been around when Mr. Anselm's heart stopped. Anyhow, I meant to go look at that bottomless pool. All I was truly sorry about was that my guitar had gotten broken. But while I was saying all that, Mr. Bristow had gone running off. Now he came back with a guitar he had at his place, and he said he'd be honored if I'd take it instead of mine. It was a good guitar, had a fine tone, so I put my silver strings on it and tightened and tuned them and tried a chord or two. Winnie swore by all that was pure and holy she'd pray for me, by name, each night of her life, and I told her that would sure enough see me safe from any assault of the devil. Assault of the devil, John, she said, almost shrill in the voice. She meant it so truly. It's been you who drove the devil from out this valley. And all the others said they agreed her on that. It was foretold about you in the Bible, said Winnie, her voice soft again. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. But that was far too much for her to say, and she dropped her sweet, dark head down, and I saw her mouth tremble and 2 tears sneak down her cheeks. And I was that abashed. I said goodbye all around in a hurry. Off I walked where the paths would be, strumming my new guitar as I went. Back into my mind I got an old song. I've heard tell that the song's written down in an old-timey book called Percy's Frolics or Relics or some such name. Lady, I never loved witchcraft, never dealt in privy wile, but evermore held the highway of love and honor, free from guile. And though I couldn't bring myself to look back yonder to the place I was leaving forever, I knew that Winnie was a-watching me, and that she listened. Still she had to strain her ears to catch the last, faintest end of my song.